actually the finance of the loss and damage. And the loss and damage is somehow different from the adaptation to the issues of the climate change. The loss and damage is concerned about the compensation of the damage that happens because of extreme weather events like the droughts or the floodings that affects countries. So many countries have been, like the floods in Pakistan. You can think about the other flood events in the Middle East as well. So these countries who have not contributed necessarily to the global greenhouse gas emissions are the most impacted by the effects of the climate change. So this has been included in this year COP. The other item in the agenda is the finance, is the mobilization of the finance from developed to developing countries in the region. So I've been there for the first week, and the negotiations are happening around those issues at the same time. So it's really not easy to follow with everything being there. But in general, I think so far from what have been seen is like there is not much of a progress. If we speak about the finance, we need to mobilize 100 billion annually. And then also in terms of the finance of the loss and damage, we haven't seen any agreement yet, but we have seen some countries like Germany have put some money, but the developing countries are not happy about that because we need to have a long-term framework that compensates countries for their loss and damage. My research honestly have been focused on the Middle East. And I think I would like to highlight also on what are the implications of the COP27, which has been hosted by Egypt, and the next year the UAE is going to host COP28. From my observations, I think there is a lot of progress and momentum actually in pushing for the climate action across the region. We have seen, and this COP has been dubbed as the COP of implementation. So it is really interesting what we see in the region, at least in terms of the issuance or the launch of the targets and the initiatives. We have seen 5 countries in the region have launched or established commitments to the net zero target. And since it's a COP of implementation, we are more now concerned to move from just putting targets or initiatives, but more to the implementation. And this last week during the COP, Jordan, for example, put forward a national strategy for the climate change. Egypt, before the COP, also put a strategy. And also last week, also Oman put forward a strategy to achieve its net zero target, and the UAE have done so also before the COP itself and in preparation for the next year COP. So perhaps I stop here, but happy to take more questions.
Thank you. Caroline, Aisha mentioned that this is an issue that has ramifications specifically for the Middle East. There are often discussions about the connection between climate change and security, and insecurity particularly. Could you speak on that?
Of course. First, I just want to thank the American University of Kurdistan for having me here. This has been a wonderful time thus far, and the discussions have been quite dynamic, so thank you. Regarding the security effects of climate change in the Middle East, I think that there's been a lot of discussion, and in some cases sensationalism, about, for example, climate change creating conditions that would breed terrorist recruitment and create terrorist hotbeds and hotbeds of instability and flashpoints geopolitically, which, of course, there is that potential there, but I think that the effects are a lot more nuanced and complicated, with demographic effects that I think are worthy of being explored by governments and, of course, their partners abroad. I want to focus on 2 cases. One, of course, is Syria, and the other is Iraq. And explore some of this mischaracterization. And yesterday we had a discussion about the over-securitization of climate change, but also explore how this affects human security and even health, and how this is a problem that is metastasizing, that the United States, its partners, and Middle Eastern governments should absolutely look at. Now, in the case of Syria, it's a very dire picture. Climate change, of course, is not the sole driver of instability and human insecurity in the country, but rather it's a multiplier and an accelerant. It has a long history with climate change before the war even started. Policies intended to boost agricultural production, for example, the redistribution of land, subsidies, diesel subsidies, quota systems, that characterized the landscape of that Syrian agricultural system. Of course, for Syrian farmers, that rug was pulled out from underneath them after subsidies were taken away, and then, of course, the introduction of a war that lasted over a decade. And this drove, of course, a lot of displacement. Warming temperatures exacerbated this problem, the decline in soil moisture, and then, of course, bouts of year-long droughts. And this especially devastated Syria's breadbasket region in the northeast. And as you all can imagine, violence, instability, and war made this situation worse. The infrastructure for sanitation and agricultural sectors was destroyed. And this, of course, displaced many communities of farmers and herders. Another recent drought, of course, recently occurred with record low levels of precipitation. And to top it all, of course, you have competing state and non-state actors that are vying over control of water sources. And this, of course, not only includes river flows, but also water pumping stations and water treatment plants. And this has effectively cut off hundreds of thousands of civilians from both clean drinking water, but then, of course, water for agricultural purposes. So what you get is a witch's brew of environmental security conditions that render a rather bleak picture in Syria. And this, of course, could have potential for increased clashes, competition over resources, but what we've seen, at least immediately, has been widespread human insecurity and health effects that I think should concern us all. There was a recent dam construction in the Khabur River, and there were also deliberate interruptions to river flows in the Hasaka and the Aluk water stations, plus dumping of oil and contaminated water into these water systems that Syrians use every day. And for many regions, this has exacerbated floods, insecurity, and of course a country with already high levels of breadlines, food insecurity, and then of course poor quality healthcare. We've already seen evidence of poor quality with livestock. Many farmers have reported their livestock dying or having to switch to different types of food that they give their livestock, such as straw mixed barley instead of a more high quality grain. And then, of course, as you know, as many know, there is the recent cholera outbreak in both Syria and Lebanon. And this, of course, has been exacerbated by the climate change crisis, especially with Syrians trying to outsource unsafe water from few water sources like the Euphrates River, and then using it for drinking and water and farming purposes. Few also, of course, have diesel to pump water as well, and this has exacerbated this crisis. Lebanon, of course, this is what I think the first case of cholera in 30 years that they've reported, and then, of course, in Syria, you can only imagine the human security effects. So I just wanted to outline the potential repercussions in Syria. In Iraq, I have just a quick few stats that I also want to say. The NRC did a very fantastic survey of the climate change crisis in Iraq. And out of 1,341 households, they recorded, households reported 90% wheat failure, 25% reported no net profit from their crops, 25% said that they were reliant on food assistance because of this water scarcity. 4% indicated a desire to move to urban areas. 25% said that they had to change their water source. And I think this last one is quite interesting. 1/3 reported social tensions. Now, this could, of course, mean competitions over jobs, competition over resources, but one can only imagine the type of demographic change and potential security implications with such lack of access to resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, is the Middle East up for the task of dealing with these kinds of climate pressures?
It's a big question. And this is an enormous topic, and there's, of course, a real limit to how much of it we can broach in a short period of time. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the barriers, some of the obstacles to kind of collective climate action. So in basically every state in the wider region, there are varying degrees of apathy as a kind of hurdle, as an obstacle to overcome in taking collective climate action. Now, the bitter irony is that when you visit rural parts of this country and practically every other country in the region, there's very little in the way of doubt about the gravity of the climate challenge. And yet, when you come to rooms like this one, not necessarily this one, but rooms like this one, it's a very different picture. There's perhaps an understanding that climate change is real, that climate change is a problem, but there's little sense of urgency. There's a perception that this is some kind of unaffordable luxury that, given the array of other kind of debilitating challenges, that this region simply can't afford. That is an obstacle that must be overcome, not least because climate change is not, and the environment at large is not just the birds and the bees and the butterflies as it's sometimes presented as being. It's the food you eat, it's the water you drink, it's the air you breathe. And I think we can all agree there are very few things more important to that. There's the inertia, and this is very much a problem, unfortunately, in tackling climate action in this country and further afield in the region and, well, across much of the world. And that can be because, I mean, ministers to me have suggested to me in interviews in Baghdad and elsewhere that they're firefighters. They're just bouncing from one crisis to the next. But the thing that officials really, really need to come to understand, and I hope those of you in this room will take this on board, is that every single one of the headline issues, jobs, health, education, security, are intimately tied up with wider climate and environmental action. And part of all of this is grounded in a series of misconceptions that are very, very widely shared. I mean, there are many misconceptions, but to bring up two. The first is the sense that this is a phenomenon that's sort of beyond the region's control. A point that I quite frequently make, and I get a lot of pushback, is that for the time being, environmental degradation, non-climate related environmental problems remain a significantly more debilitating issue in this country and everywhere else in the region than climate change itself. A lot more water is lost, or at least rendered useless, by poor water management and pollution than is lost due to drought. Equally, the effects of extreme heat are perhaps magnified by the sort of impractical construction techniques, et cetera, you get the drift. And there also needs to be just an appreciation that this is an unbelievably hard challenge. This is a series of challenges that even wealthier, significantly better kind of managed and more stable regions of the world would struggle to grasp, particularly when they come accompanied with so many other crises as they do here. However, there are no quick fixes. I mean, in many years of environmental reporting, particularly with a sort of climate security focus in this region, there can be a tendency to go for those quick fixes instead of the extremely difficult, nitty-gritty, unsexy work that comes with revamping an entire political and economic system. Ariel, I know you don't want us to take too long. Would it be useful if I sort of broach a few entry points for potential collective action?
I would love some optimism in the room. Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm usually the sort of emissary of doom and gloom, so sort of trying on something new for once. But there is quite a lot of room for, or reason for a degree of optimism. And among them is that there are a few little sort of green shoots of emerging collective action against climate change among states. So back in May, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Kuwait met to discuss one of their kind of shared climate-related challenges, dust and sandstorms. As I think everybody in this room is aware, they're becoming that bit more pronounced, that bit more debilitating. And the very fact that they met to discuss this shared challenge, instead of kind of just pointing fingers at one another, as had been the case for the preceding years, was an extremely positive development and something to build on. There's a lot of work that can be done to improve dust and sandstorm modeling. Equally, I mean, in the European Union, as of the last few years, there's a scheme to sort of pool and deploy shared firefighting resources. Now, unfortunately, given the degree of deforestation, the volume of woodland left in the wider region is not what it ought to. However, this does seem to be a rather manageable way for the region to take on this increasingly debilitating series of wildfires that are claiming much of what is left of that woodland. I mean, we saw with Turkey and Lebanon kind of sharing some of their relatively meager number of firefighting targeted planes, that this is something that can help as a sort of trust-building measure. And I have a number of other points, but perhaps the last one to make at the moment is share environmental data. Now, data, particularly in the kind of science and environmental space, is widely seen as something to be treasured rather than shared. And that's a tremendous issue, because there is perhaps no space more than environment, which requires transparency, which requires the shared pool of statistics and data. So just leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it now to Neil and see, do you think the region is ready and able to tackle these tasks, whether it's climate-directed or simple, more simple, basic pollution measures?
Thank you. I sort of picked up at least three words from Peter. I'm going to throw them back and then feel a little concerned about them: apathy, inertia, and unsexy, which is the worst one of the three. I think there's certainly potential, but first of all, I want to sort of just maybe tie down what we mean by region, because that term is problematic. Yesterday we spent quite some time thinking about words. When we're talking about region, if one looks at, say, the Middle East Green Initiative, that takes into account the wider region here, but that brings in Brazil, that brings in India, that brings in Tanzania. I think we need to sort of focus in a little bit more there. And when I was sort of speaking to Mary Fitzgerald coming in this morning, we were saying that Libyans have a very different sort of focus on climate. They look much more towards the Mediterranean and their European partners than, say, in the Gulf. So I think we just need to sort of map that out a little bit and be careful what we're talking about when we're focusing on region. I'm going to talk mostly about the Gulf, and I want to talk about sort of the Middle East Green Initiative. But one thing I try to crowbar into every talk that I give at the moment is I'm a big fan of Sylvia Plath, and she's got this beautiful quote which I love, and my colleague Jessica knows I crowbar it in everywhere. So if you'll just forgive me, I'll read it, and then I will try to make sense of it. She says, "If neurosis is wanting two mutually exclusive things at one and the same time, then I'm neurotic as hell. I'll be flying back and forth between one mutually exclusive thing and another for the rest of my life." Now, why I think that's relevant and why I think that's important in our situation is if one's thinking of COP27 first off, Europe wants to push towards renewables, but at the same time, it would really like Africa to develop its gas. Those are two sort of mutually exclusive things, I would argue. In the Gulf, I think John had said in the last panel, I mean, there's a big drive, a big push to get hydrocarbons out. I think the Saudi minister, the Emirati energy minister, and certainly the Qatari energy minister has made that very clear. There's a huge push there. But at the same time, of course, there is a drive on renewables, and we are seeing investment in renewables. Again, sort of two mutually exclusive things. And as a corollary of that, and I think this is a point that really needs to be teased out, and it's something who Jessica Obeid was on a panel previously. She talks about quite a lot, and that's hydrocarbons economies are centrally driven. It's all about centralization, whereas a renewables market or renewables economy, there's clearly a central dimension to that, but there's also a large decentralization of that. So you have these mutually exclusive points. We have a central system and a decentralized system. And if one's looking at the Gulf specifically, we have seen a deepening and a consolidation of political and economic power, particularly over the last decade in response to the Arab Spring. And we've seen a tighter grip on centralization. So a desire to really build and develop a renewables economy somehow plays against that. So these are just a few framing points. Now to come to your question about, is there potential for collective action? If one looks at the Middle East Green Initiative, yes, there is. You've brought together 20 states. They came forward last November 2021. They've just had a leaders meeting at COP27. And, I've made a series of commitments. I mean, there is a commitment to plant 50 billion trees, to reclaim 200 trillion acres of land as part of, land to stop land degradation. These are very laudable goals. There's a fund that's been, put on the table, $2.5 billion for 30 years to support green technologies, and also pledges to help produce sort of clean fuel for cooking. So there's an ambition, and I think this is where your sort of thing on inertia and apathy, I'd push back a little bit, saying I think in the Gulf there's actually like this kind of excitement almost that this is a space we can move into and we can adopt and we can own. But then I come to Aisha's point about, this is being the implementation COP. And I think it's great to have ambitions, but implementation is key. We all say this all the time. And my son will sometimes say to me, Daddy, I can't wait to be a medical doctor. And I say, okay, you're going to have to study quite hard to do that. And that's fantastic that they have that ambition. But then he wants to play on his games. He doesn't want to do the reading. And I have to try to sort of make out, well, the only way you're going to get there is by doing that. And it's all about implementation. And I think that, another word that keeps coming up is capacity. I'm not sure there is capacity. There may be political will at the top to sort of institute some kind of multilateral mechanism to try to push forward on some of these changes. But I'm not sure that there is the real capacity and real drive to actually make it happen. So I think, the will's there, but I'm not sure the way is there.
Thank you. That was slightly less optimistic, but not nearly the negative as I was expecting. Aisha, I want to come back to you. You touched on an irony of these COP summits as being hosted by countries that are heavily reliant on hydrocarbon exports. That's, of course, a feature across the region, in Iraq, in the Kurdistan region, Saudi Arabia, obviously Iran, that we don't have to go over the list of hydrogen exporters. Do the hydrogen exporters, the net exporters, play a special role in these sorts of sessions? Do they have a special responsibility? What position do they expect to be in here?
So did you say hydrogen or hydrocarbon?
Hydrocarbon, sorry.
Because hydrogen, we are still a long way to get to the hydrogen. Right. So yes, the hydrocarbon-rich countries or oil exporting countries, they are involved in the COP very heavily. And then there is some statistics have been released initially on who is attending the COP this year. And then the initial statistics, it shows that the people from hydrocarbon organizations or countries have been dominating the COP this year. And again, the COP is about representing different groups of people, countries from different contexts in terms of the socioeconomic background. So we have, for example, there are different groups. Like, for example, we have the Arab group led by Saudi Arabia, for example. We have the G77. We have China. We have developing the like-minded group. They come together. And also we have the developed nations. So the negotiations really happens between groups out there. And the hydrocarbon-rich countries, they try to, of course, put their voice there. And one of the items that is negotiated or discussed during the COP, what is called the impact of the response measures. So the impact of the response measures is it's basically means how the advanced climate policies globally could influence the interest of different countries, like small islands, for example, and for the hydrocarbon-rich countries, like how the advanced climate policy, for example, the momentum for the deployment of renewable energy or the hydrogen, or enhancing energy efficiency somewhere else is going to affect the hydrocarbon-rich countries. So this has been discussed for a long time and have been integrated in the negotiations for a long time. And so around that, actually, that also, when we speak about the implementation, these countries are trying to find solutions where, the life of the hydrocarbon will continue to stay for a longer time, but they haven't put themselves in a position where, we will keep hydrocarbons, but we will keep emitting our greenhouse gas emissions. They've tried to push for solutions that keeps the hydrocarbon, but at the same time mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So an example, as I mentioned, the Arab group is led by Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia have put forward this circular carbon economy approach, where the hydrocarbons will still live longer, but the kingdom is trying to find the solutions that mitigates the emissions out of the hydrocarbon, including, for example, the scale-up of the carbon capture and storage, the development of the hydrogen, the scale-up of the energy efficiency, and the development of renewable energy. So it's basically looking for the solutions that not put restrictions on certain types of fuels, but to be more finding a more of an inclusive approach for fighting the climate change, but not restricting or putting a pressure on a certain economy. And there's also, in the negotiations, there are lots of terms and jargons, and then one of the things is the CDBR, the common but differentiated responsibilities. So the hydrocarbon countries, they put this term, integrated this term into the negotiations, and they keep using it all over in a way that any advancement in climate action does not affect the economists and should take into consideration the specific context of those economies. But from my point of view, in the past, we did not have, during the COPs, the engagement of the hydrocarbon, groups, and that wasn't really a good thing, because we need those who are responsible about the greenhouse gas emissions to be involved in the negotiation and to be involved in finding the solutions. So to have them in the COPs, I think is a good thing. And indeed, we will see a backlash. We will see a push between the different groups. That is perhaps in a way it's natural, but what I can see, and I like to be optimistic, because in the past, speaking about the solutions to climate change, it wasn't that much, especially for the Middle East region. But most recently, we have seen at least the terms of sustainability, the solutions around it, like the hydrogen, is taking momentum. And so this is a good start, I would say.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pose a question to the panel as a whole, and you can pick it up or leave it as you choose. When addressing climate change and environmental crises, we have a budget. We have a budget of time. We have a budget of money. And I want to know, in your sense, where should we be prioritizing? Should we be prioritizing the energy transition? Should it be in the compensation fund? Should it be in mitigation and preparedness? Should it be in reduction? Where's the primary? Where will we get the most gain, do you believe? And I think we can ask this question generally about the globe, but I think it might be even more useful in this circumstance to talk about a country like Iraq or perhaps the Middle East region. Where should the efforts be? Where would the efforts be most impactful, most fruitful?
I can
please
pick up a small part of that very big question. I mean, to my mind, time is a bigger limitation than money, both within a regional context, putting aside for one moment the discussion as to what region constitutes, but also in a global context. I mean, there's a reason why just for the benefit of perhaps the very few people in the room that don't know, there's a reason why we talk about 2030. Like, 2030 is the point at which a lot of these like really vicious climate feedback loops will likely be at least partly irreversible, no matter how much we've reined in emissions over the intervening period. And so the corollary of that is that I'm one of these people that sort of really believes in climate action at almost any cost. Like, I disagree with Caroline a little bit in that, so working in the climate security space, there's a very, very strong pitfall to securitization, as she mentioned very correctly. To my mind, those pitfalls, however severe, are worth navigating given the really outsized, understandable outsized importance attached to security in the region. So if you have empowered security actors, if you have security players with kind of significantly greater resources at their disposal than you do within the environmental space, well, to my mind, if you can get them concerned about climate change and willing and able to act in a hurry, to my mind, that is worth some of the unfortunate side effects that will likely constitute the securitization. So yeah, time is at an extreme essence in a way that money is in many instances kind of there.
Okay. Anyone else? Neil?
I think the answer has to, so again, I focus on the Gulf, so the answer has to be transition. There has to be the push on transition. There has to be the push on developing all the different types of renewables and deploying that at the large scale, but also deploying that at the much smaller scale, at the local level. But you come up against the resistance, and that's the life scale or the lifetime of hydrocarbons. I remember, I think it was 2015, 16, when MBS gave his interview to the Economist and said, we've got to get off oil. We're going to get there by whatever it was, 2030. I mean, we're nowhere near that. That's going to be 2050, 60, 70. Who knows where that is? So the time factor is absolutely critical. But the issue with the Gulf states, at least, or the oil-producing states, is they want this to last as long as possible until there's an alternative. But for the Gulf states and for Saudi and the Emiratis in particular, pushing and developing on renewables also frees up export capacity as well. So it's a very, very difficult and uncomfortable space there. But pushing on that transition for the rest of the world is absolutely.
Is energy transition a luxury good? We've used that phrase before, that only rich countries will be able to afford to have solar panels and high-end lithium batteries to capture and store, or is it something that will be democratized around the globe?
No, I think it'll be democratized around the globe, and I think we can already start to see some of that. I think solar panels can operate at relatively low cost. We can see them operating within local communities. That's part of the sort of decentralization drive I was saying. I think once that can be mobilized and that can be operated at less of a centralized system. It's power generation needs to be centralized, but then as Jessica was saying, it's about distribution networks, it's about transmission networks, it's about getting that in place. But tying up to the grid is something that can be done at a local level. But it's certainly not a vanity project. I think it's critical.
Aisha, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to come into that. Yeah, I don't think it's luxurious. I think, especially if we talk about the Middle East and where we talk a lot about the economic diversification, I think the energy transitions goes hand in hand with the economic diversification. And yeah, the cost of the renewables, as Neil mentioned, is really competitive at the moment. It's not that expensive to have solar panels, and countries with different income level can afford really to deploy the renewable technology. And when it comes to renewables, it's not, when we think about quickly about the large scale projects, but as Neil mentioned, it also comes in the small scale. So it could be available to everyone. What it really requires is the political will from different governments. But the renewables and the other things like energy efficiency, the hydrogen, these are going to create new markets. They are creating new value chains, and they are going to create new jobs. So, and it's going to attract the foreign direct investments if we speak about like the large-scale projects as well as small, medium enterprises. So it really goes hand in hand with the economic diversification. So, I think it is not a luxury, but it's a necessary thing to do at the moment, especially if we look at the future. So there are a lot of outlook reports that look on how the value and the demand and the price for the hydrocarbon will be affected in the future because of the advanced global climate policies. There are a lot of reports that shows the value and the demand for the hydrocarbon would decline in the future if the countries, was serious about their climate commitments. Now, we said that this is a COP of implementation, and what does that mean? It means like from next year on, actually there will be a mechanism where the countries' progress on their commitments to climate change will be evaluated, and the time frame for it has not been agreed about yet, and it's discussed at the moment at the COP27, but there is a talk whether to have it every 5 years or every 10 years. Mm-hmm. So the country's performance will be evaluated. So that makes a push for everyone to take action on the climate, and that would perhaps materialize into reducing the value of the hydrocarbon in the future.
Thank you. Caroline, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a quick point. I think Peter made a really great point about the time crunch that we have. But looking at the Levant, which is where I specialize, I see some hope with governments like Iraq and even the government of Lebanon. But in Syria, I think it's a much dire picture, given that the stakeholders that do have the very limited capacity, I don't see it as a priority. And when it comes to the local stakeholders as well, I think that there could be some capacity, but it's hard to kind of envision. And so when you talk about 2030, which is not that far down the road, I think that in Syria it's going to get much worse, and it's going to be very difficult without a political solution in Syria, or without at least a way to navigate the aid system and even the short-term priorities of safe water sources and access to resources. I think that it's a much trickier landscape. Whereas I think in the GCC and the larger region, there are different dynamics at play. But in Syria, I think it's going to be pretty tough.
Thank you. Well, I want to turn the microphone over to the audience. We're not going to have as many questions as we had last time, but I'm happy to take some questions. We have about 20 minutes. So I want to, Madam, Sir, and then in the yellow in the back, please.
من بسیارا من با مستر پیتر مایک بکار بینیدم با هنده دب گهیدین شاید.
Just wait 1 second. Do you have a translator here?
دست خوشی الهوات گم بوی بابت زرزوری گیرن از گلستان هیلی اندام پارلمان کردستان ما بسیار اک ملویره هیا گومان تدانی نه گو هر ولات اکتیویت پش بستن بخوب لسر خوبه که تنجبو پاراستن جنگه آخو اول که چهار سری بگیری تنجبو هنده خوب پارێزیدن لی اف کمبونت هینا کرن لسر آست جیهانه جب لسر گهرین کش و هوا جب لسر پاراستن جی تکچون جنگه اره اف ولاتا چند شیانه چهار سری که نوان آریشان و ببینن گو اف گهرین کش و هوا دزانن یعنی اف گهرین کش و هوا مترسیه که لسر مروایت که چون که روز بروج اف مترسیه روز یه پتر لیت هیتن متویتن و بسیاری برسوان بده زور سپاس.
Thank you. Please, sir, I saw your hand early.
شكرا سيد رئيس الجلسة، وشكرا للذوات الذين تكلموا بهذا الموضوع المهم. والمثل العربي يقول ليس من رأى كمن سمع. أنا جئتكم من جنوب العراق وتركت خلفي عشرات الآلاف من القرى العراقية تعيش حالة الجفاف، وكذلك الحيوانات التي نفقت، سواء كان الأسماك التي تعيش في الأوار وكذلك الحيوانات الجاموس. وهذا الخطر الكبير الذي تمر به القرى العراقية في جنوب العراق. ولهذا أنا أتوجه بالسؤال للأخت السيدة عائشة، أنه مؤتمر شرم الشيخ هل اتخذ قرارات بهذا الصدد؟ وهل غاب عنه هذه المأساة التي تعيشها هذه القرى في جنوب العراق؟ أرجو الإجابة وشكرا.
In the yellow in the back. And then we'll take another round after this.
Hello, everyone. So this is a question for all the panelists. So around this time last year, the former president of Iraq, Barham Saleh, announced Iraq's commitment to the Mesopotamian Revitalization Project. This project, as we all know, aims at addressing the effects of climate change in Iraq, which prioritize preventative positive measures such as planting trees and promoting the generation of clean, renewable energy, as well as improved water management in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So my question for all of the panelists, I'm very curious to know, because I'm constantly writing about climate change issues in Iraq, and I haven't received much information about where the plan currently stands. If anyone knows, I'm very curious to know. Is the plan still being used? If not, should the Iraqi government continue using the plan, or should the government make new amendments to the plan? Or should it adopt a completely different climate change action plan? And if a new plan should be adopted, what should the plan consider when combating climate change in the region? Thank you.
Okay. I think we have three very good questions and many people who can answer them here. So please, Aisha, there was a question directed specifically to you.
Yeah. I can comment very briefly on the first question on the human security and whether we discuss this in the negotiations. Unfortunately, we don't do that. It is not part of the negotiations, the human security and the migration issues. It's not yet, I think. So the loss and damage is new to the negotiations. I think what should happen next also to push for the human security dimension into the global negotiations. Regarding the second question, the impacts of the climate change in Iraq and whether it is discussed during this, big climate conference. Well, so Egypt, being the host of the COP this year, it has been pushing actually for addressing the climate-related issues in the Middle East and the water security, the extreme weather events like drought, and the need for the adaptation to the climate change. This has been an agenda that the country tried to push. It's trying to voice out the climate-related issues in the different Middle East countries. And when I have been there I have seen for the first time there are specific pavilions for the water and the food and the agriculture. However, this is okay, this is happening in a conference, but how can Iraq or other countries benefit from all of this? So what needs to happen at every country level, we need the representatives from each country and from each government where they try to, put forward the research needed to, investigate the impacts of the climate change in these countries. For example, in Iraq, how the southern part of Iraq is affected. And then, put forward this kind of research to the policy makers in the government. And, for this global community of the climate, what they are trying to do is actually to provide the finance of the adaptation. So it is really important to have the capacity, the human capacity in the country to evaluate what we really need here, what is the real issue here, and then write a report to the UNFCCC designated department and say, this is how we are impacted, this is the amount of the finance that we need. And actually, like myself and colleagues from the region, from Mohammed bin Rashid School of Governance and other entities in the region, we we put together a report, the Arab Region SDG Index and Dashboard Report, and we evaluated the performance of the countries and their achievement of the 17 SDGs. And the overall result, it shows that the Arab countries are not performing well in achieving the SDGs. We found that only 6 countries in the region are 2/3 their way on achieving the SDG, including the climate action. So what I wanted to say, we tried to identify what are the reasons behind this lag in the performance. And of course, we found that the human capacity has been an issue because especially for the countries that are not, have a high economic wealth, these countries get, assistance or aid from outside. And so there is a lack of studies on how the countries, low-income countries, are impacted by the climate change. And because also of that, there is, the human capacity, the lack of the human capacity, there was this gap on communicated what the country needs, what kind of assistance the country is need. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done from both directions, from the country level and also from the global level. I think also the global community should also put more efforts on going into the ground, really, especially for low-income or countries in conflict to help find out the solutions out there.
Thank you. Thanks, Aisha. So, Peter, you have the ear of a member of parliament.
Okay. Thank you.
What would you want to convey? I
mean, if I understood the question correctly, like what should or could a country like Iraq do in the face of climate change? It's a good one, and it's a tricky question to respond to. On the one hand, you have mitigations and reining in fossil fuel emissions, and on that count, Iraq, as a leading fossil fuel hydrocarbon producer, can and should take additional steps to certainly reduce gas flaring, a phenomenon that all of you are undoubtedly extremely aware of. But in terms of kind of dealing with the immediate consequences, sort of adaptation, as it's referred to in the field, the place where, to my mind, Iraq should place its real priority is addressing, as I mentioned earlier, the non-climate environmental problems that the country is also up against. I mean, much of the water that Iraq does receive, much of the water that is not lost to drought or that is not lost to Turkish or Iranian dam construction, is either lost due to kind of leaky and inefficient irrigation systems, or it's dirtied so much by wastewater that it's simply not usable. And so, without getting into the whole kind of Turkish-Iranian dam issue, one of the reasons why it's so easy for sort of Turkish and Iranian government officials to push back at Iraq's attempts to take issue with the dam construction program is that Iraq is so poor at dealing with the water that it does receive. So to my mind, that should be the absolute priority. And that kind of ties in a little bit with my brief response to Zainab's question. I'm not completely sure what has happened with Iraq's climate strategy. I think it got quite kind of slowed down by the fact that the former president, Salah, has been pretty distracted by internal political issues over the past year. But to my mind, kind of as solid as much of that strategy was, it was perhaps not quite as focused on water as it needs to be. I mean, the majority of Iraqis see water as the kind of manifestation of climate change that affects them most, and with extremely good reason. And I mean, before 2015, the Ministry of Water Resources under Hassan al-Janabi had this $80 billion plan from 2015 to 2035 to completely revamp the country's kind of water infrastructure, much of which is leaky and inefficient and not fit for purpose. And then along came the war against ISIS, and that entire program got knocked off kilter. So that perhaps ought to be an absolute priority, particularly at a time when high oil prices ensure that actually it is, in theory, affordable.
Thank you. I'm going to take 2 more questions from this side of the room since I didn't look at you the last time. I'm sorry. Please, sir, in the middle there. And anyone else? You had a question already. It's over there.
Hello.
Yeah, this morning.
Hello. This is for. This is for all the panelists. My name is Seja. I'm from the Atlantic Council in DC. So climate action is foremost about the environment, but it is also has a profound impact on business, entrepreneurship, jobs. So what are the economic opportunities you believe that the Kurdistan region and Iraq can potentially benefit from? What are policies and areas of focus that Erbil and Baghdad should aim to implement and innovate to not only combat climate change, but also as ways to improve and diversify their economy?
Great, thank you. And sir, in the tie in the corner there.
Thank you, Ariel, and the esteemed panelists. The COP27 was launched under the title of implementation. The question is to Dr. Aisha and Ms. Caroline. Do you think that with the current crisis in oil and gas globally, and which is affected by the Russian and Ukrainian war, there is a chance to start a real implementation, or we should have to wait until the next few years?
Great. I like short questions. Thank you. Please, this will be our wrap up. So you can handle the questions, or you can give us your final thoughts as you see fit.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So on the question on the economic opportunities and what are the policies that could help, I think we can look at it from 2 directions. From the government level, what the government can do is actually to support the entrepreneurs in terms of the financial needs, in terms of the training programs that they need, as well as simplifying the regulations and the policies for them to set up their businesses, but also to incentivize the involvement of the businesses in the sustainability. Perhaps the government could put forward special incentives for those people who are involved in this process. Probably that could translate in no taxes perhaps, or less taxes compared to other businesses. And then on the point on the global energy crisis and whether it's affect the implementation, I think we have seen a distraction, because what happens because of the crisis, the energy security came as a priority compared to any other thing else. But I would say this is a short-term distraction, because oil-producing countries have been put under pressure to produce more oil or more gas, and we have seen the visit of President Biden to the Gulf region, and other Western leaders came to the Gulf region, for example, asking for more oil and gas production. But what we have seen at the same time, also we have seen the discussion or the countries discuss between each other the possibility of developing alternative energy fuels like the hydrogen, and memorandum of understanding have been signed already to push for the cleaner energy. So I think it's a short-term distraction, but in the midterm and the long term, I think the implementation would still happen.
Great, thank you. Caroline?
I'll keep my response extremely short. In regards to the ongoing war in Ukraine, I think I completely agree with Aisha in that it has, I think at least from kind of a PR standpoint, it has been a bit of a distraction. That being said, I think it's prompted many countries, particularly in the EU, to have a very hard look at their energy sectors and think about the future and what those energy sectors should look like. And I think that alternative energy sources have come into the conversation, and I think that's a very good thing. And I think that, again, reiterating Peter's point, I think that we don't have much time, so we really should be incorporating this, and we really don't have much room not to. In regard to the question about Iraq's business sector, how the KRG also can, of course, create opportunities, I think that when we look at some of the demographic trends, particularly migration to cities or suburbs of urban areas, I think it's very important that we look at the landscape of fostering a friendly business climate, but also fostering a lot of opportunities not only for youth, but for those who are heavily engaged or were heavily engaged in the agricultural sector, and creating opportunities for them as they're moving around. I think that, again, such fast-paced demographic change has its challenges, and I think that is a very key way that both the KRG and Iraq can address.
Thank you.
Just building on what Aisha and Caroline have said, but taking it a little bit further, yes, I think this is a huge fillip for Europe, and I think it's a huge fillip for North America in particular. I think the drive towards renewables, the drive towards alternatives, is going to accelerate once they've overcome this. And in fact, I've been working with some energy companies and sort of trying to sort of scenario what that might look like. And I think we could find ourselves in a world where the energy systems actually begin to bifurcate, where Europe, North America, and a few other countries go down the renewables path, but the hydrocarbons is sustained where it is, and you've got this kind of energy bifurcation of the world taking place, and I think that's actually a really concerning point to be at.
There you have the last word.
Yeah, just to go back to the question on Kurdistan's capacity to benefit from at least some of this force. To my mind, much of that could come within the space of agriculture. I mean, I don't think anybody in this room needs to be told about the lost agricultural potential within Iraqi Kurdistan and within northern Iraq at large. Many of the reasons that farmers are turning away from agriculture, of course, have nothing to do with climate change and environment. And yet, speaking to many people who work the land across the region over the past decade, they do talk about their need for superior seeds. They talk about their need for regular fertilizers. And at a time when large parts of southern and central Iraq and agricultural land elsewhere in the wider region is being rendered less and less viable for agriculture, this is an extraordinary opportunity for Kurdistan to sort of regain its lost kind of agricultural heritage. So, yeah. My last comment on that.
Thank you. I want to thank the audience and thank the panelists for participating. We are almost back on time.
Thank you.
I am glad to welcome you all back, and for our last, but definitely not least, session of the day. Session 4, titled, China, Russia.
To be here, I want to thank MEPS, the forum, for putting me to work today. I'd like to earn my keep. I'm also very proud and happy to be back here in Duhok and at the American University of Kurdistan. You know, it was almost 18 years ago that I first came to Duhok. The time the city was, I would say, a third of the size it is today. There was very little electricity at night. There was certainly no American University of Kurdistan and no real public fora that I was aware of where people from all different backgrounds could come and talk and exchange views and learn from one another. And I just wanted to say that because the progress, the work, in spite of enormous challenges that Duhok and the Kurdistan region have been through, you have achieved an enormous amount in almost 2 decades. And I hope the collective pride that you all feel in your accomplishments will fill you with what Kak Sarhang had earlier today referred to as spirit, and a spirit that will carry you forward in the light of the challenges that we will all be facing, and you in particular will be facing in the years ahead. Thank you. We have a really terrific panel here today, which in some respects will cover some of the themes that were expertly dealt with in both the first and the second panel this morning. Although we have 4 experts with deep regional expertise who also happen to be regionally situated and have a unique perspective on the new global situation in which Iraq and Kurdistan and the Middle East now finds itself. The post-1991 moment has clearly passed. As worlds are wont to do, they tend to disappear. I realize that this is not news to a lot of people in the Middle East. It has come as news to many Americans, and my country is right now trying to figure out our best strategies, our best plans for navigating this reconfiguration of power, the new politics that are reshaping Asia in profound and far-reaching ways. As we think through this, the Middle East has become more and more less of a priority for the United States, as has been discussed later today. I myself would say that this is baked into the nature of things, and that some people in my country had anticipated this reality even 15, 20 years ago. Today, the United States sees itself in a very much a many-fronted struggle, but principally a 2-fronted struggle. One is to preserve the security and peace that we fought long and hard to achieve in Europe, which is now under threat by an aggressive and revanchist Russian regime. The second is to keep the general peace in Asia, which has been the foundation upon which, the economic foundation, I would say, upon which so many of us have enjoyed and benefited from the last world order, which is now in the process of disappearing. I think the United States is confident that with the close cooperation of our allies and security partners around the world, that we can handle these challenges. But it is going to take a lot of creative thinking on the part of the United States and its closest friends here in the Middle East to deal with these challenges as they begin to increasingly impose themselves on the Middle East itself. And we've yet to figure out the proper modes, the proper ways, the proper common understandings of the challenges that we're facing. So I see this panel as very much the first in what is likely going to be an epochal or epic defining discussion between us all here at AUK and beyond, because this great power rivalry between Russia, China, and the United States, which is unfolding across Eurasia, as I mentioned, is and will be impinging itself in this region and in Kurdistan in profound ways in years to come. So as I mentioned, we have 4 panelists. Their names have been introduced. We've agreed beforehand that all of the complicated questions are going to go to Miss Anna Jacobs, who's sitting next to me. But she's also going to be our first speaker. And I'm going to lob a softball her way, which is to ask, how does this look from the perspective of the Gulf? And please, Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm also mindful that there are translators, I think, working extremely hard. So I'm going to try and speak as slowly as possible, too, just to make sure everything I'm saying is clear. I am American, but I have been living and working from Qatar for the last several years. I do focus on GCC countries. I spend a lot of time doing field work in Qatar, but also in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE as well. So I'm going to try and highlight as much as possible how these countries, I think, are navigating, but also perceiving great power, competition, and conflict. And then I want to, if possible, also try to keep my comments quite brief, because I think it would be excellent to just have as many questions as we can from you all. I'm very eager to hear from you all also. But again, I know some of the panels earlier addressed a lot of these points, so I'm just going to try and summarize them briefly and then bring up maybe some new issues as well. You know, as we heard, Gulf states are adjusting to an emerging multipolar world order and do perceive, rightly or wrongly, that the U.S. is strategically pivoting away from the region. This structural context, I think, is very crucial. They are all pursuing significant economic diversification initiatives to move away from their reliance on oil and gas. And this energy transition is also crucial. I think this is pushing them to pursue economic and political diversification regionally and globally. Globally, this looks like the growing ties, obviously with the US, but in particular with Russia, China, India, and Europe also. This is another point that I think we haven't really addressed yet, is also what do we mean when we're talking about great powers? I know and I think many others often assume that kind of always means US, China, and Russia, but there are obviously others too. And there are kind of the great powers that we perceive now, but will they be the same in 20 years and 50 years? So I think that's also something to consider as well. So even as Gulf states are expanding their ties with China, with Russia, as we heard earlier, the US, I do think, very much remains the most important security partner now, and I think it will remain that way in the future. You know, and again, a little bit as we also heard, Gulf officials emphasize over and over that their geostrategic interests are both in the West and in the East, and that right now, I think more than ever, there is a strong desire to assert their strategic autonomy in the face of growing great power conflict and pressure for them to side with a Western camp over an Eastern one. And obviously, I know as several people mentioned earlier, all of this kind of dichotomy of West and East is obviously a very essentialist way of looking at it. But I do think that language is used. The second point, if I have time, on the Ukraine crisis. I think in the context of the Ukraine war, Gulf states to varying degrees are maintaining working relations with Russia. perhaps the most important example of this is Saudi-Russian cooperation through OPEC+. Interestingly as well, though, Gulf countries have also offered to support international mediation efforts. And I think a recent interesting example of that is Saudi Arabia and Turkey both helping to facilitate a pretty major prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine, and I think that was in September. And I think we could be seeing more of that. UAE's president traveled to Russia. I think that was also end of September. Met with Putin. The messaging surrounding that visit from their side that this was to support de-escalation efforts. Qatar's Emir also met with Putin, but in Kazakhstan. So I think what we've been seeing since February is that these countries are trying to keep working relations and I think lines of communication open with Russia and Ukraine. There are, of course, different approaches and tactics pursued by each of these countries. But I want to highlight kind of one key moment, though. The UAE's decision to abstain on the UN Security Council vote that basically criticized Russia's invasion. That initial vote in late February, I think, was very interesting. The UAE abstained following India and China as well. And I think that was kind of a strong early signal that many of these countries did not want to come out too strongly in criticizing Russia. Instead, I think they wanted to walk a cautious, and I think in their words, what they would view as a more sort of independent line. And also, I think that while many of these countries disagree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they do not want to get caught in the middle of what I think many of them view as a European conflict. They do not want to destroy their relations with Russia because of their various economic and political interests. I think also for much of the Middle East and Africa, this is how it is viewed. You know, I don't think it is viewed as a sort of international order defining issue in much of the world the way that it is for many in the West. And I think if I have, sorry. And then I think the very last point that I'd like to just raise, and again, it came up a little bit earlier, but I think we can expand on it somewhat. I think that what is most interesting is that Gulf countries, I think, are pushing back against the U.S. and others viewing and implementing policy through the lens of great power conflict. I think in their view, the Middle East should be handled, looked at, dealt with for its own reasons, merits, and because of its own strategic importance for the global economy. And I think that the kind of most recent example of where this kind of clashed is the OPEC Plus meeting in October and the kind of recent, I would say, rise in U.S.-Saudi tensions. I think this is a case in point for how the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are viewing and framing the OPEC Plus decision through separate lenses. So for many in the U.S., I think this decision was seen as Saudi Arabia choosing to help Russia over the US, but over kind of more broadly Western interests. And thus, I think being viewed, again, primarily through the lens of great power conflict, whereas the narrative coming out of Riyadh is very much that, you know, this was a decision that stemmed from their economic and national interests. So it wasn't so much about prioritizing Russia, it was about prioritizing their own national interests. So I think that it's really important to focus on this narrative, I think, and I mean, I'm focusing on GCC countries, but I really do think this is true in other ways throughout the Middle East, but also in Africa too. I think there really is this desire for asserting more autonomy and asserting their national interests. And then maybe I'll stop there.
Okay.
Sorry.
But I'll come back because I want to ask you later on about a perspective that's emerged in the United States, that it's not just Saudi Arabia, but or the GCC, but countries in Southeast Asia, for example, that are choosing actively not to get caught in the middle of things. And I wanted to ask you whether you would concur with the view that Saudi may emerge in years ahead as the leader of a sort of new non-aligned movement, which is a school of thought, but we'll come back to that. Abdullah, sir, you're next.
On the same topic?
As you wish.
Thank you, Eric. And first of all, I want to thank AUK and the colleagues here for the kind invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be here in the Hawk, Kurdistan, and to meet colleagues, friends, people I haven't seen for a long time. So thank you all for this kind invitation. I think to look at this situation, as you described it and being described eloquently by Anna, I think it depends where you sit. Where you sit determines what you see. And where I sit now, I've got the floodlights in my eyes, so I can see you very well. So if you are in the Middle East, it's different from being in Europe, or if you're or in the United States, the West Coast or the East Coast, or in Asia. So that's something we have to take into consideration, is, you know, where are you and how do you see things? And we'll come back to that point, if I may, Eric. The other thing is, when you're talking about the Gulf states, we need to also understand what do we mean by the Gulf states. Are we talking about the GCC states? We're talking about Iran, Iraq, and maybe Yemen, and so on. So we need to kind of take that into consideration. We're talking about the Gulf. So let's focus on the GCC states, if you like, and maybe we can say, maybe others can say something about Iran and Iraq. But even talking about the GCC states, there isn't a one policy that fits all. We are talking about 6 different states with almost six different foreign policies. I come from one of those countries myself. I come from Oman, which, as you know, has its own unique foreign policy. But equally, you could say that about almost any country in the GCC. They have their own foreign policy. And just to go back to where you sit, I also work in Japan. So I see things differently from that end, if you like, not necessarily with an Omani lens, but with the way that Japan also looks at the world from their perspective. So I think that is something we need to, we have to avoid generalization in a way, because each country has its own independent, to a certain extent, foreign policy. So what does this mean for the GCC states, the global power conflict? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it beneficial? I will bet my money to think that all the leaders in the region think this is great job. Go for it. Why not? If you are in conflict with each other as great powers, we have a space to maneuver. These are the fundamental policies of any small country. A small country does not like to be dominated by one power, and they don't like the idea of also a two-pillar world, because then they will have to choose between one side or the other. But when we are going through a multipolar world, then you can understand the small countries find more space. They find agency. They know how to, be able to look after and get their best national interest by maneuvering within this space, as it were. So they feel that they are being less dominated, and they feel that they can have more freedom to act. So that is another thing. But there is something else that I would add to this and throw into kind of this very complex picture. And we should not forget the geoeconomics. Geoeconomics is very important. That, to a very large extent, determines where and how you see things and what lens you see it. But Gulf states, GCC states, if you like, most of their oil and gas was exported to Europe and to the United States in the past. Is it still the same now? Certainly not. It's been pivoting east, as well as the US is pivoting with its policy towards the east. Gulf states' interest and geopolitical interest and geoeconomic interest is also pivoting towards the east. China is their largest energy consumer and has become their largest trade partner. Since 2008, I believe, 2007, 2008, it's overtaken the EU as the GCC largest trading partner. The US is now competing in energy output, as it were, with the shale gas, shale oil, with the Gulf states. So you can understand why they would want to look east. They would want to have good relationship with China, etc. So this is something else that we need to take into consideration. Their geoeconomic interest is shifting more and more towards the east. I haven't said much about Russia, but Russia has not really been a very important economic partner in a way. I think the relationship with Russia has been quite either political or defense and security issues, when they can get, sometimes where they cannot get arms from their Western partners, they would go to Russia, or if they want to kind of twist the arms of the United States, they would go to Russia and do the same. Maybe my friend here from Russia would correct me on that, but I feel that it's not being seen in the Gulf state as a major trading partner. Although things could change over time. So Russia is a different ball game altogether when it comes to the Gulf state, but they see it as a very important partner because of its oil and gas reserves and production. And therefore, they want to work with it because they know their future relies on this oil and gas exports. And if they cannot work with Russia on that front, then it could affect their economic well-being. I also want to say something. I don't know how much time, Eric, you want to give me, but I think we also have to add into this very complex picture the idea of having the hegemonic power, the security guarantor for the Gulf states, for the GCC states, which is the United States, as you know. But this relationship actually suffers from reliability. The Gulf states look at the United States as an unreliable partner. Whether we like it or not, that's how they look at it. You know, they have seen it. It's not just because of recent episodes, but even in the past. I was talking to some people in some of the Gulf states' government, and they were saying ever since the US invaded Iraq, the idea of diversifying their policies has become top on their agendas. And since then, they started looking at the US as not necessarily a reliable partner who would want to, to work with. And to add to this conundrum, if you like, it's an unreliable in one hand, but it's also an indispensable partner, because they don't see anybody else who can come there to support their and guarantee their security. They cannot do it themselves. They are unable to work together. Either individually or collectively, they are unable to secure and guarantee their security. They are not unable to work with other regional powers as well to kind of guarantee their security. There is a lack of an overarching security architecture in the region that they can rely on. They know Europe is not in a position to be able to support them in any way, only in very limited sphere. So what do they have? You know, China cannot be a partner that can guarantee their security. Russia certainly not, and there has been issues with, in terms of relationship with historical issues with Russia in the past. So here they have an unreliable partner, at least this is how they view it, but at the same time, it's an indispensable partner, at least when it comes to security issue. So you have the United States guaranteeing, or the security partner. You have China now is the economic and energy partner. And then you have Russia that is, in between, as it were, giving them an alternative to kind of diversify their relationship. So if you ask me how do they look at it, from where they sit, not where I sit, with the lights in my head, but from where they sit, I think they like the situation. I think they love it. The more diverse this relationship, the more multipolar the world is, it's better for them. Does this mean that it is going to be stable? I think in the long term, it might be, and that's how it should be. We should be living in a multipolar world rather than a unipolar or so on. But while it's going through this transition, it's going to be very hectic. And until it comes to a level where it is stable, I think it's going to be quite scary for them. And they will try and, navigate through this through own policy. Let me just finish with one more thing. We have to remember that the GCC leaders, when we look at the GCC, and if we're looking at them in the 80s and the 90s, it's different from what they're looking at, what we look at now. Not necessarily in terms of their economic development, diversification, visions, et cetera, but we are also looking at a very different creed of leaders. We are looking at new leaders, young leaders, who have seen the world, who have traveled, who have seen the mistakes in the past, and they are very different from their predecessors. So that is something that we need to also take into consideration. And they can be bold, and they can even go against their own people, let alone, and their own families, let alone their own strategic partners. So we have to take that into consideration when we are looking at this region. I think I should stop here before we get into more trouble.
It's terrific. We'll get into trouble a little later, I hope. Nikolay.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I guess I need to make a small clarification that the person who was supposed to talk about Russia here, she couldn't make it, so I'm the last-minute replacement. And as opposed to her, I don't want to be deceived by the public being deceived by you. I came not from Russia directly, but I came from Qatar, where I have been living for the last 4 years, and where I have been affiliated with the Gulf Studies Center. So, which means I have no connections with the Russian institutions, and those views that I'm speaking here is solely mine. Definitely, the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it became a substantial game changers in many areas. But when it comes to the Middle East and Russian approaches to the Middle East and Russian connections with the region, I would argue that it became more a catalyst that actually speeded up or intensified those processes that was happening in the region way before the events of February 2022. And in this regard, what we see, we see that basically the war intensified these connections, but the reasoning for this intensification was different on both sides. So if we take into account Russia itself, we definitely see it being interested in the Middle East and in the active connections with it within the Troika trilateral set of goals that existed even before. So Moscow is actively using its connections with the region, politically speaking, to avoid international isolation and to counter the creation of an anti-Russian coalitions in the Middle East, or the possibility of creation of such a coalitions. It's also still using the Middle East as a cheap way to project power and to remind about itself as a global player, or at least a country which is trying to pretend being one. Economically speaking, still Moscow is interested in cooperation with the Middle East, and I completely agree with my colleague and friend Dr. Abdallah that indeed in the sheer numbers, the volume of these connections might seem not that big and important. But if we take into account the selected industries where cooperation is going, we'll see that the Middle East matters. Not to say, of course, the situation in the oil and de facto gas market and cooperation within OPEC Plus is extremely important for Moscow to affect the situation in the hydrocarbon market, and to shape the further developments there. And finally, we also should remember the security concerns that exist among the Russian leadership. Especially nowadays, Moscow is not interested in emerging alternative or secondary sources of instability or challenge in the region. So that's why interaction with the players, especially those who can affect the post-Soviet space in different ways, are extremely important. What was added by the Putin's invasion of Ukraine is, on the one hand, importance of this region for the sanctions circumvention. And we already see that Russia learned a lot from Iran in theoretical terms and is actively using Iran in practical terms. So I would like to draw your attention that one of the first projects that Russia revitalized with Iran was the project of the North-South Transport Corridor, which provided the necessary, is supposed to provide the necessary infrastructure for Russia to access Asian market, Indian market, as also a road through which Russia can facilitate so-called alternative imports, or better to say, to find a way how to smuggle necessary goods in Russia itself. And the second moment is that right now Moscow, in its relations with the Middle East, will be more interested in putting emphasis on the political and diplomatic incentives, just because the military involvement or participation in military endeavors like one we saw in Libya in previous years, they are quite risky, and Moscow is also overstretched. So that's why the preferences will most probably be given to the political and diplomatic initiatives, and preferably within the multilateral format, or the format that would allow Moscow to drag even non-regional players into the discussion. However, when we look at the regional countries, and that's where I usually bringing the example of the oil and gas producers on the Middle East, and specifically of OPEC+, we can suddenly find that actually the interest or in interaction with Russia is determined not by the Russia itself, but by the relations of these countries with other players. And from this point of view, again, I completely agree with my friends that we should understand and we should see the situation from the position of the region. For the region, Ukraine and Ukrainian events is something which is happening far, far away. And it's definitely, there is also a certain disappointment regarding the fact that the international community, and especially the West, is reacting on these events in Ukraine far more actively and openly than to the events in Palestine, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And this creates a substantial temptation for the region to exploit the situation for the pragmatic needs, for the pragmatic sake. And if we have a look in the relations between, for instance, energy producers of the Gulf, and the best example here for me, Qatar. Qatar that knows that Europe right now needs its gas, and in a short-term period, relatively short-term, so within the next 4 or 5 years, it will have available resources. It wants to exploit this conflict to bargain at better conditions for its presence in the European market, just knowing that the Europeans are cornered. Same can be applied to a number of other players in the region who are now see the West being much more interested in the region than before, and exploiting this interest for negotiating better conditions. If we go deeper, we'll also see that the fact when, for instance, making a decision on the recent cuts in oil production within OPEC+, the political flavor that existed in this decision is actually covering a substantial number of pragmatic and economic factors that were related with the understanding that the market is unstable, that were related to the understanding that basically Europe is trying to put pressure on Russia on a number of issues that will definitely be further destabilizing market, and it wants OPEC Plus actually to take the price of this destabilization on itself, which was causing another question: why should the region take this price, given its disappointment in reliability of the United States? Of course, we can spend a lot of time here arguing whether this is a perception has strong connection to the reality, or it exists in the minds of the regional decision makers, but it exists, and it definitely affects the perception. And finally, there is also an understanding that Russia still matters for oil markets. It's still a substantial oil producer. Yes, with the falling capacities, potentially substantially falling capacities, but it doesn't make it still unimportant and unreliable. And that's why it doesn't make sense to spoil its relations right now and bring in the political or ideological connotation DNA into the economic processes. So as a result, what we see two interesting processes happening. On the one hand, Russia is getting more and more interested in the Middle East and will be entrenching its position even in spite of the overstretched resources, driven by the necessity of its own survival. And on the other hand, the Arab countries, and not only Arab countries, the Middle Eastern countries, with a certain exception, of course, they are moved closer to Russia, but mostly because of the considerations that are not directly related to Moscow. So as a result, those statements that we see a new alliance between Russia and the Middle Eastern countries being born, they don't have a basement under it. We should largely consider the situation from the pragmatic point of view and for extremely pragmatic behavior of all participants involved. And that's probably where I used all my time. And I'll be happy to continue this discussion during the Q&A. Thank you.
Appreciate it. We'll come back. We wanted to hear, now that we've traveled to the Gulf region, wanted to hear the perspective from Lebanon and the Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you very much for American University here and the MEPS Forum. Coming from Beirut, as you said, and particularly from the oldest American university in the region, AUB, I really wish AUK a long life as the one and an abundant one as the one that AUB had for more than now a decade and a half. It's really very impressive to be here. In fact, although I come from Beirut, I'll try to take more of a global vision from the region and then maybe revert it on and tackle on certain issues that we have heard since this morning, because in fact, many people here have touched upon issues that we are discussing. Just to start with, I would like to take like Abdullah, not a geographical point of view, but a chronological point of view, and tell you how much things have changed in a very quick time. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the day before, I happened to be in Moscow for a conference. And I mean, in February of last year, when you looked at the map, the world map, and this is something that we were discussing with colleagues in Moscow 24 hours before the invasion, people were really, impressed and amazed by the extent to which Russia has become able to talk to anyone in the region, in a very complicated region. It has good ties with Israel, good ties with the Gulf state, good ties with Egypt, good ties with Syria, protecting the regime, good ties with the Kurds, with the Turks, with the Iranians, etc., etc. And how much Russia has been able to leverage with a very low cost its quite mediocre military apparatus. Now it's obvious, but we knew it in Syria. I mean, Syria was really a low-cost operation, and it leveraged it to the maximum, saving a regime, maintaining its position. How much Russia had the image in the region of a power that stands with its allies, not like the US, as you said, Abdullah, who dumped Mubarak under the bus, who reluctant to defend the Gulf state. So you had this image of Russia, and a Russia that was even able to open up to new allies in the region. Historically, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, etc., were not really friends of Moscow. And then at the same time, at the same moment, you had the vision or the image or the perception of a US, as many of you have said, that was retrenching, hesitating, fumbling, not knowing if the Middle East is still an important pawn on the chessboard or case on the chessboard, wanting to pivot to the East to prepare for a yet hypothetical competition with China in 2050 or something, neglecting the micromanagement, at least, of the region, and we saw it at many levels, even in Lebanon for small cases and small examples, and telling the Europeans, obviously and openly, it's now time for you to think about your own defense and your own, strategic autonomy, the famous term that has been later on taken on by President Macron and others. This was the image, this was the vision and the landscape in February of last year. It's not even a year. All this is now reversed. So things are really very volatile. All this is now reversed, and I frankly don't have, because it's volatile, definitive answers to many of the questions that we are having here. And instead of answering, I would maybe add to the questions. And by adding to the questions, maybe we get closer to an answer. I don't know. It's a philosophical approach. One of these questions, and someone touched upon that in the morning. Maybe it's John Alterman, who is now taking a nap. is, for example, one of the first, and this is where I am completing the landscape here by adding, and as you said, Abdullah, I mean, the point of view of Europe, which is specific also. It's not exactly Atlanticist or etc. Will, for example, the Ukraine war, if it drags on and really becomes a pivotal event in world's history, will it reconstruct a West that was starting to unravel? I mean, before this crisis, I've lived in France for more than 15 years in my life. This is also a question of point of view. There were serious questions about what is the West with capital W. I mean, when I studied in France, in Sciences Po, we had a famous book on les Occidentaux. Is it something still existing? Is Westerners a category? One of the great issues of the war in Ukraine is that one. Will it reconstruct a kind of Western civilization, if you want to talk in Huntingtonian terms? This is a big question. And what will happen to the European defense and to the European entity itself? I mean, in one of the panels, our Italian colleague was talking, for example, of the obsession of refugees coming from Ukraine. We lived it with Syria, etc. Is Europe able today to really take again its defense in its own hands? And as many Arabs were advocating for a long time to have a sort of independent European diplomacy and defense, this is a big question. Will it be, on the contrary, aborted by the war in Ukraine? Second big question, so this is really an open question, and it has an impact on the future of the region. Second big question, if the war in Ukraine is going to drag on, and yesterday we were close to a very, I mean, almost nuclear type incident in Europe, okay, with the missiles shot on Poland or inadvertently shot in Poland. I still don't know if it's inadvertently or not and who shot it, but it's not the question. Are we really at the eve of a new Cold War of the type that we knew? Ambassador Khalilzad talked about this morning about, I mean, this bipolar, then unipolar, and etc. Are we back to a sort of unipolar moment? You said it would be with China in the future, but for now it's with Russia. But in a strange way, with a Russia that is, let's say, a false giant. I mean, I don't know how to characterize it. But if it drags on, and the US is back to a more securitized, militarized policy internationally, partly in the region, in the Middle East, are we heading towards a new tension, more than maximal pressure towards Iran, for example, at a moment where the war with Ukraine, I mean the war in Ukraine or the Ukrainian crisis, has on the contrary very much reapproached Iran from Russia and China. We have a new axis today. So the new Cold War will have another taint. It will not be the same, at least for this region. And the question of Iran and how to fix it, as we discussed yesterday in the closed meetings, will become again a crucial question. I'll come back to that in my last point in a minute because it concerns certain countries of the region. But at the same time, if we go this way, what's also new, and you said it all, the countries that were traditionally America's allies in the region are today also cozying to Russia and China. I mean, the Gulf, others, etc. So this Cold War will be very different in this region from the one that we have lived before in this region again. Another question, and here I very much liked what you said, Abdullah, at the end, but I will go further. In the meantime, in this region, be it in Turkey, be it in the Gulf, be it elsewhere, you have a new breed, a new generation of leaders who are more, you said, more cultivated, more autonomous, intellectually, technically, etc., but they are also much more assertive, more aggressive sometimes, and more arrogant. I mean, the fact that in the way with which, for example, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman dealt with President Biden when he called him a few months ago is something that is, I mean, unprecedented. Refusing to take a phone call is something that at least I never heard of coming from a Gulf ruler. So we have this new vision, this new world vision, this new self-vision of these new rulers. And here the question is, again, what will happen if For example, the Ukraine-Russia war drags on. We go towards a new Cold War where the two supergiants or superpowers will be entangled. How will these leaders behave? And we know that they are now much more inclined to take issues in their own hands. But what is the direction of that? What will they do with this power in their own hands? And what if, on the contrary, this new Cold War or the war in Ukraine is resolved to the US advantage, and the US is back to the region but with a vengeance on these people who, as someone said this morning, I mean, they are forced to choose today and they are not choosing. But what if America gets out of this victorious and comes again with a reckoning, let's say, reflex? So these are the many questions that I would have. I will end up on a note completely from the region, because we're talking about the global system and the region, but how, I mean, there are things that also are happening or have happened in the region that will bode a lot, that will weigh a lot. First of all, we said it yesterday also in our workshop, this region has not yet, and I think that Fred Wehery this morning said it, this region has not yet solved the set of very touchy, difficult, sensitive, explosive questions that put fire to the region some 10 years ago, the Arab revolutions. I mean, the entire set of questions, socioeconomic grievances, new generations coming to the labor market, the question of dignity, the question of pluralism, the question of inclusiveness. I don't want to talk about democracy. It's not a fantasy for me, but these are the things that are behind democracy. These are mechanisms that help people live in a more dignified way. None of these questions have been solved, and not only none of this has been solved, but it has been exacerbated. Sisi regime is much more fierce than the Mubarak regime. Assad is still in power. Iraq is still crippled with a lot of corruption and a lot of misfunctionings, and et cetera, et cetera. So what if a new cycle of Arab revolt and upheaval and uprising starts when, for me it's sure that it will happen, I don't know when, maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years, I don't know. And what will be the world scene at that moment? Will it be under a moment of unipolarity, of bipolarity, of Cold War, of multipolarity? And I think this is also a question that is very anguishing for the region. The last question from the region is something also that we haven't really examined sufficiently. How will Israel behave in this new world? In this new Cold War world, in a post-Cold War world, if it finishes? How will it deal with threats like Iran, if Iran is not fixed? Will this bring the region to a new cycle of conflictuality? I think this is the panel of tomorrow about, are we heading towards peace and understandings in the region, or on the contrary, because there is something still open there, all this is very volatile and very elusive. So this is why I will end on these questions. I'm sorry for not having answered. I prefer sometimes to raise questions than to answer. But again, I think that by raising them, you bring elements of answers to other questions. Thank you.
It's terrific, Joseph. Thank you. Perhaps a question for the entire panel before we engage with the audience. And it is perhaps a speculative question, although we already have a relatively recent track record to do a lot of informed speculation on it. And that is, as Russia returns to the Middle East, as China, a new Arab West, and deepens its involvements here economically, technologically. And I realize that this is controversial, but there's a school of thought in America that China has power projection ambitions, which are likely to be revealed a lot sooner than a lot of people would anticipate, including here in the Middle East. My question is, how has and will the involvements of these new actors affect the internal rivalries and power balances that already exist in the region, for example, between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And how also, and you could answer this question instead, how might the involvements of these actors affect the governance challenges that Joseph had brought up? Could they be beneficial to actors in this region in seeking to reform governing institutions and to get ahead of the festering problems that a lot of polities in this region are facing? Or could they actually exacerbate the problems in terms of, for example, through their investments or their enabling of kleptocratic and authoritarian regimes? That's my question for the whole panel before we... You want to go first, Anna?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Yeah, I also kind of want to bring, I feel that the conversation that we're having too on great power competition at times can seem abstract too. And I wanted to kind of raise, what's actually happening, I think, right now. So, for example, the first ever China-Arab Strategic Summit is being held in Riyadh next month. China's president, I believe, is attending as well. And I think potentially soon after that, the Baghdad summit will also maybe happen. So I think you have these two, I think, quite major processes that will be taking place next month. And I think it's interesting to maybe think through a little bit too, and this will answer your question. And their bilateral ties. And in it, the Chinese foreign minister underlined very clearly, too, that, and I think this was maybe one of the only times that he said it this clearly, that the Chinese are very focused on developing the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I think, obviously they have had solid ties with Saudi Arabia for a while, but I think there was this notion that China was somehow more aligned with Iran, and I just don't think that that's true. And I think that they're very much focused on keeping good relations with all of the various actors. So I do think, maybe this is overly optimistic, but I do think that that could actually be something that is helpful. I do think it's something that could, and especially through this framework of regional economic diplomacy. I think that China, the U.S. could also, but I think that the Chinese are uniquely placed to actually play a role in cultivating that. So I guess I'll stop there if that's fine. Yeah, thanks.
Bella, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. Rick, I actually missed quite a few points earlier, so if I may just go back to one of them, was that when we're talking about, a multipolar world, China, the rise of China, Russia, we tend to forget that there is another power coming up as well, and that's India. We really need to take that into consideration. That's a very important sleeping giant that could, at some point, play a very important role in the region. And there are historical links. There are not least the number of migrant Indians that work in the region. And it will have a very, very important impact in the relationship, I think. So that's one thing I wanted to add to this. The other thing I wanted to add, I talked about the leaders and that they are young leaders, as it were, ambitious and so on, and you mentioned them, Joe. But who do you think they would prefer to deal with? Some U.S. president that gets elected every 4 years or so, or someone who's going to be there with his party for the rest of their life, and they know who to deal with. I think this is important to take into consideration. They think they are dealing with a reliable partner. Even if the president goes, the party value is still there and the relationship is still there. Look at how much they invested in President Trump. And what happened? Everything went away. And I'm sure this is, gets them to think, what are we doing here? Yeah. Difficult to deal with the US politics, and especially internal US politics. Very difficult to understand European politics as well. And no one understands the EU, even the Europeans themselves. So, it is very, very difficult for them. So it's easy for them to deal with that kind of leadership. And if you take into consideration the other issue, which is, the values, human rights, democracy, and so on, these countries don't care. China doesn't talk about human rights and democracy, so does Russia. And, and they feel that they're pressured by their European partners, US partners, etc. And it affects even their, transactions and their policies. So that is something that they take into consideration, which is the political system. But even if you go to the economic system, and I think some of you alluded to this earlier, what do you see now in most of the Gulf states? You're seeing state capitalism. That is very important. State capitalism, and that is exactly what's being practiced in China. State-owned companies. Almost all the Gulf states are now neglecting the whole idea of supporting private sector and so on, and focusing on state capitalism. And the state themselves becoming, through their own business arms, becoming the owners of this business. So they see this as a model for them. The rentier state, whatever it is, the economic system, is actually a working model that they see China has succeeded through this, and they see it as something that is useful, that fits in within their own values, within their own interest. And then if you take into consideration the other thing, and I'm saying this not necessarily trying to blame one side or the other, I'm trying to kind of dig deep into this, say why is this happening, and why is the Gulf states focusing more now on diversifying their relationship. If you dig deep into it, you will see that they have had this relationship with the West for a long time. But apart from selling them arms and kickbacks and all of that, and and whatever goes in between, what is the economic benefit that the Gulf states have actually got from the West? With a big W or a small w. Where are the investments? Where are the projects that one can actually talk about? Obviously in oil and gas, because of their interest, but mostly selling arms. So it's very transactional. But there is nothing that you can say that this is something that's been built in the state to develop the economy. On the other hand, look at China. There are so many projects that are coming up. There is the Chinese investments in ports and so on. Obviously, there are issues with the Chinese investments. I'm not saying that there isn't, but this is how they look at it. They see that the Chinese are coming. They want to build their, they want to be part of this Belt and Road initiative. They see it as a future for not just the region, but the whole world. They see them expanding. They see them, they're happy to kind of share their know-how and so on. And they see them as a real partners that they can deal with. And I think that is important to take that into consideration. With that, I will try and answer quickly your question. I think, Eric, it's a very important question. I think that the relationship with China and Russia will somehow help to de-escalate more. Because some of this conflict is between Iran and the Arab neighbors is obviously historical, ideological, confessional, whatever you want to call it, or bid for hegemony. But then when you have a partner, powerful partner like the United States, is also on your side, you become entrenched in that views. So I think if there was if the United States wasn't there, I think they will have to be more pragmatic. And obviously there is pressure from the United States and some of these countries, and not to go far away in terms of having good relationship with Iran. So I think if the United States was to pull back a little bit, you will see, and you see this when the JCPOA negotiations start to warm up a little bit, you see the Saudis and the Iranians start to talk. So I think with less US pressure, you will see some pragmatic policies that are going to kick into this relationship, which helps to have dialogue and maybe de-escalate some of the conflicts that we have in the region.
Yeah, that's very interesting and very helpful and curious as well to me, because I always saw the United States, at least on a good day, as being a force for encouraging pragmatism.
Depends where you sit, Eric.
That's what I know. That is indeed true. Nikolai or Joseph, anything to add to the question?
Just quickly, 2 points. I'm a little bit, I disagree with the fact that Russia is rising power. I think that
I agree with that too.
the cost which it's paying right now in Ukraine will substantially limit its potential for expansion in other region, and basically, at best case scenario, we'll see it trying to guard what it got in the region. In the worst case scenario, diminishing their presence, but it's a separate topic. Where I really agree with Abdallah, it's Dr. Abdallah, is that both Russia and China, they representing a certain role model for the leadership in quite a number of Middle Eastern countries, showing that it's possible either to survive, if we're talking about Russia, or to develop, if we're talking about China, without, economically speaking, without creating democratic institutions or developing the substantial public presence. But if we come to, if we think in the long run, indeed the future of the majority of the Middle Eastern countries, especially the oil and gas producers, will be connected to the situation in Asia. And in this regard, we should speak not only even about China and India, but about growing economies who will boost the demand in oil and gas in the next decades, and at whom the Middle Eastern countries are looking already now. And we also need to understand that right now the situation in the oil and gas market is abnormal. We have political factors affecting the market fundamentals. And overriding their impact. But in the long run, we'll see the stabilization of the situation when the Middle Eastern countries will need to think about ensuring the demand on their hydrocarbons and on their hydrogen, if we speaking about the long-term perspective. And in this regard, again, the only way to ensure it is through the long-term contracts and through the development of the on the one hand, demand in these countries, and on the other hand, developing political background that would ensure the long-standing of these contracts. And those who are successful, they will definitely have an upper hand in the international relations as well in the region and beyond that. Just to remind you that before we had the COVID pandemic, we could saw the certain race among the GCC players for new contracts in Asia, in China, in India, and not only. And Mohammed bin Salman was visiting China. It was interesting also to watch in 2019 that he was basically meeting not only the political leaders, but also the representatives of the Chinese army. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce all this official name of it. It's too long and difficult to remember. But it was done on purpose because the Chinese army is one of those who are forming the demand on hydrocarbons inside the country.
Yeah, right. Thank you. We have about 15, 20 minutes for a discussion with the audience, and I'll work from the left and over to the right. And as is our custom here, we'll aim for balance. And please, if you could, keep your questions or your comments as concise as possible, because we want to be mindful of people's time. Sir. Yeah.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أعتقد أن النظام الدولي الجديد بدأ يعبر من أحادية القطبية الجامدة إلى أحادية القطبية المرنة، وكل المراهنات على أن جائحة كورونا ستبرز نظام دولي جديد لم يحصل، وكذلك كل المراهنات على أن الحرب الروسية الأوكرانية ستؤدي إلى نظام دولي جديد كذلك لم يحصل. فإذا الحرب الأوكرانية الروسية لم يؤدي إلى حرب عالمية، ولم يؤدي إلى نظام دولي جديد، ولم يؤدي إلى حرب نووية، ولم يؤدي إلى بروز محور اسمه الصين، إيران وروسيا. أنا أسأل أن الشتاء هذا هو التحدي الكبير. إذا أوروبا وأمريكا استطاعوا أن يعبروا هذا الشتاء بطاقة أقل سعرا ومتوفر، مو مثل الحطب الآن يوزع في ألمانيا، في سوبر ماركتات ألمانيا الآن يوزع حطب. إذا استطاعوا أن يعبروا هذا الشتاء فإنها ستتكرر أو قد تتكرر ستالينغراد الجديد أمام الجيش النازل هتلري عام 1943. الآن هناك دول إقليمية مثل إيران وتركيا تمارس رسم حدود دولية من خلال طائرات مسيرة، بيرقدار وطائرات مسيرة. هذه الدول تبحث عن أدوار بدون أن تعترف الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بأدوار هذه الدول. أكيد ستبقى فراغات تنفذ منها روسيا والصين. فالمباحثات النووية الإيرانية الأمريكية إذا نجحت فهي من صالح المنطقة واستقرارها. وعبد الإلهيان قال قبل 72 ساعة استلمنا رسالة أو أوصلنا رسالة إلى واشنطن، والنتائج الكونغرس الأمريكي تبشر بخير بأن هذه المباحثات ستصل إلى نتيجة يوما ما. وشكرا.
Thank you. Shukran. Shukran. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the big concerns is, of course, not only that at least from the United States' perspective, not only is Russia's aggression murderous, but it's also seen as being quite self-destructive. And with that characteristic, it raises a lot of questions about the kinds of activities that Russia might involve itself here in the region in, given its penchant for self-destruction. U.S. deeply worries about what happens if a Russia that deindustrializes and destroys itself, if it begins to disappear. That upsets power balances all across Eurasia. So it's very, very helpful and also quite scary. Thank you. Ambassador Galbraith.
I hope I'm not going to repeat the previous question, which of course I couldn't follow. But wars, of course, rarely turn out as the people who launch them think they will. And I'm sure Mr. Putin's learned the same lessons as many other leaders have, including some American ones. But my question is, I mean, what happens if Russia loses the war in Ukraine? And I suppose I could define losing as further Ukrainian advances. But in some sense, you could argue that Russia has already lost the war because it failed to achieve its objectives of reaching Kiev, overthrowing Zelensky, annexing Ukraine, whatever the objectives were, which of course are a bit uncertain. But what does a Russian defeat, either the failure to achieve its objectives or even a more serious defeat, do to Russia's role in the region, but in particular in Syria, where it's a mainstay of the Syrian government, and in Iran, which has to some extent, perhaps not to some extent, aligned itself with Russia in the conflict, particularly with the sale of drones.
Nikolai, could you handle that question briefly, and we'll move on?
Well, sure. First of all, I'm not an expert on Russia itself. so I cannot answer you what were the goals of the operation. But if we're talking about the region itself, I don't think that we will see Russia pulling out of Syria. I mean, for Moscow, the Syrian endeavor is still cheap. And that's why we see, certain limitations in terms of number of manpower they keeping on the ground. But they believe that their presence there is one of the leverages of influence in the Middle East. So they will keep it to the last. What will change is the psychological perception of Russia. And that's important. There will be a heavy blow to the vision of Russia as a important player, or, well, of course, not equal in terms of its impact to the United States, but still capable to exercise certain power and influence in the region. Because even right now, if you are talking to the Middle Eastern elites, they are saying, Putin failed to get Kiev in 3 days, as he promised, or some of the Russian analysts was promising. But same happened in Syria. And I'm just citing them here. So Putin didn't manage to end the war in 3 months as he promised, but in the end he changed the favor of war in favor of the regime. So we just should wait. And this narrative supports the interest in working with Russia. If Russia is defeated, this narrative will definitely collapse, and we will return to the perception that existed about Russia in the region before Syria, and especially during, I would say, the collapse of the Gaddafi government, when basically Moscow behavior was considered as a treachery. So Russia will be again considered as a weak power, and this will be a serious, I'd say, blow to the Moscow positions in the region.
Can I just say, even if, what happens if the war ends with Putin's departure from power, which often happens to leaders?
Oh, well, I'm afraid I'm not able to make such a far-fetched predictions, because I have my own theories, but I'd rather speak not on camera and say.
We'll come back to that off.
They're serving good coffee there.
Joseph, you had something quick to add, and then the front row. Joseph.
To your last point, I mean, things are, you know it, I mean, a bit more complicated because everything is interlinked. I mean, first of all, when you say the defeat of Russia, will it be a quote-unquote classical defeat or a pacted defeat? I mean, will he sign a surrendering or a truce or a peace? I don't see, I mean, you know, Putin probably, although I mean, it's not because you're Russian, but I mean, knowing the man, I don't see him sitting on a table and signing a peace treaty of Russia losing. So will the madman theory apply here? Will he go completely rogue before losing, etc.? I don't know. But to get back to Syria, I mean, because it has a consequence on Syria, it depends on how he loses. If he loses by losing his prestige and his face, yes, of course, he will be weakened in Syria and in the region. But if he loses a la Granda, I mean, Hitler style, I mean, getting suicide, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get into these scenarios. The most probable scenario and outcome, and it's a coincidence that our Iranian friend is sitting beside you, probably Iran will gradually fill the void or the vacuum that Russia is leaving. And we are already seeing that. I mean, when you look at the granular of Syria today, be it not only on the military side, because we are too much focused on how many airplanes are in the air, in the sky of Syria, and etc. You have to look at the ground not only militarily. You have to look at it in real estate terms, in commercial terms, in mafia ties, in sociological networks, in religious spreading, and etc. Already today, since the war in Ukraine, Iran's presence in Syria has consequently risen. And I can tell you that at least from a Lebanese point of view. Now, this leads us to the question of Iran. I mean, will Iran at that time still be the pariah state that it is today, or is an American-Iranian nuclear deal will have happened, and then Iran is normalized in the region, etc., etc. Then, and this is my second point, because, I mean, in fact, I wanted to add something on the Chinese issue. This has to do with Syria also. It's undoubtable for me that, and this is a huge paradox, in fact, that China's soft power and its image in the region is quite positive because of the reasons that were mentioned. At a moment where it was supposed to be a hard power animal, and the American and the West is more on the soft power side. I mean, most of us study in American university. We prefer to go to New York than to Shanghai for study and etc., until today at least. But the Chinese model in terms of crony capitalism, in terms of state-led economy and etc., is something that is very, very popular in the region, and this is not new, Abdullah. I started my academic career in the 90s working on the Syrian business sector under the infitah of Hafiz al-Assad. And everybody I interviewed there, be them business community people or, I mean, public sector or private sector, and people in the regime, were saying at that time, it was 2 years after the perestroika and the end of the Soviet Union, they were all saying, I mean, Gorbachev is a stupid man. I mean, he shouldn't have done this. Look at the Chinese model.
Right.
They have opened up the economy and they haven't touched the political system and structure. For them, this was the model of the future, and unfortunately or not, it's a bet that has proven right. So the image of China as a country that is able to stand still politically and open up economically, I mean, the Arabs respect Russia because it's a military, let's say, animal or actor. But in fact, Russia's economy is not attractive for the Middle Easterners. It is China that is attractive. And to end on that, probably also one of the vacuums that will open up in Syria will also be gradually filled by Chinese, at least private sector and companies that will rebuild. And we see the start of that, at least in sectors like phosphate, cement plants, and etc.
Ma'am, in the front row.
Spas. Please use your translation. Yeah. سؤالكم بو دكتور عبد الله. I don't know if you can use it or yeah. دكتور من دموي جنابت بخما موقعتي زحمت يعني تو ذا كما please yeah. من دمويتو بكما مستشاري سركرداتي كرد يعني قيادي كردي استا تو اگر هاولاتي كردستان بي ومستشار بي للايان يكك لسركردكاني كردستان لناو بارودوخيشي آواي كهريمي كردستان تيدايا بشك بي لو هريما هريمك بي لناو دولتك وكو عراق دراوسيكت إيران بي دراوسيكي دي تركيا بي و بتحدى بهالشويك بي ما في خود بكار هنا بي بودر هناني نوت كومالك شركاتي عملاق لو هريما نوت استخراج بكن هنديشان شركاتي أمريكي و أوروبي بشيشان شركاتي روسي بن لو ململاني كإستا لمنطقة كدا جزاري تسن نصيحتك داديا سركردي كردي بووي بكمترين ريسك لو قام سياسي دربتن وكمترين زرر بو هريما بكوي لكاتك دا أو هريما تشيشي لقل خدي دولتي مركزي هيك عراق بويا من دما يبزان تو أقر مستشار بي تنسي حتيك باندكي سباس
That's an excellent question. I'm glad it's not to me. Advice. Yes.
Are you expecting me to answer this?
Good try.
Can we talk on the coffee break?
Can we talk on the coffee break?
If you don't mind. Because I need to understand the question a little bit more. But no, I mean, can we talk later?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, perhaps one way of thinking of it is if you're a small power and the large behemoth countries, many of them nuclear armed, many of them heavily armed, are encircling you. Is that necessarily an opportunity, as you described it, for more freedom, for more latitude to define your country? Or does it not also bring with it enormous risks? The smaller countries get rolled in situations such as this.
Thank you.
We'll come back to it.
Sorry, it was a very difficult question, but if I may just say something very quick on this, not necessarily answering directly to your question. But look, how many small countries in the world there are? Many. And they're surrounded by big countries and powerful countries and sometimes antagonistic neighbors. I know we are not Europe, so we're not Scandinavia here, which is very different. But there are countries here in the region that have very powerful neighbors. And historically, they wanted to, take them over or control them or something. UAE is one of them. Qatar is another. Bahrain is another. They're very small, tiny countries. They don't even have the same population as Kurdistan has, in a way. And again, they're surrounded very powerful neighbors, and everyone is trying to control them. They have Saudi Arabia on one side, Iran on the other, and they are in between them. They have dynastic rivalry, etc., etc. Bahrain thinks that they control Qatar. They used to rule Qatar, and all of that. So it's a very complicated picture. The only way to do this is through alliances, of course, and a very active and foreign policy. You cannot defend yourself militarily by yourself in a situation like that. But there are other ways of ensuring your independence and so on, and finding a way to maneuver. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Chung.
Hi. My name is Christine Chang. I'm from King's College London in the War Studies Department. Thank you so much for this very insightful and very honest panel. I really appreciated actually the conversation on China, and for the Western policymakers in the room, I think we should take heed of the notes that were made in this conversation here. But my question actually speaks to a slightly different point, and it has to do more with just thinking about great power competition in the region and how actually in the rest of the world, I think the focus has now moved back to great power competition, but before, I would say it's been shifting away from that for a while. But what happened in Ukraine has put the attention back and changed the framing in quite a different way. So just noting that as a difference in how the region thinks about things, because you've always had great powers intervening, and that's not necessarily being the case in a lot of the rest of the world, where people have just taken the framing of these discussions has been really different. And I bring that up in light of the fact that we've got a lot of big changes coming, right? So what happens if the great powers actually stop paying attention to the region in the same way, for a few different reasons? One, obviously, the U.S. has become energy independent in the past 10 years or so, right? So that has changed the dynamic of why the U.S. is not as interested in the region as it once used to be. We have the rise of renewables coming up, and what has happened in Ukraine has sped that up even more. So that will happen even more quickly. And then yesterday in the workshop, we had a discussion about the fact that global warming is going to bring the potential of a new trade route through that will just bypass the Middle East, right? So all of those things are contributing to the fact that the U.S. will become, or the Middle East will become, a much less strategically important region. What does that mean, I guess, for thinking about the dynamics here? What do you all like? What would you respond? What would you say to Middle East leaders? Hey, how do we actually make ourselves matter again in a way? Because I think part of what might come down the line is people will not pay as much attention to the Middle East as they once did for those very kind of bigger, larger structural reasons.
Terrific question. Joseph, would you like to?
Can I do it? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Eric, why don't you take a few more questions so that we can,
Should we take more? Or?
All right,
Okay. I guess I'll take a stab at that one. Christine, that's an excellent question. I think my view is a bit different in the sense, I mean, I do think that they will remain extremely relevant in the short term, but in the longer term as well. I mean, for example, Saudi Arabia, I mean, no matter what, will be a major player in the global economy for the foreseeable future, even with all of the kind of changes that you have mentioned. And I think actually a lot of what we're seeing now is sort of the rising tensions between the US and Saudi Arabia hint to that. I think Saudi has quite a lot of confidence that they matter now more than ever, which is why I think you are seeing more assertive hedging. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that. Thanks.
We have time for one final question, but we will continue this conversation. This gentleman over here, please. Here in the front row. Thank you. Do we have time, ma'am? This gentleman here, and then here in the
My name is Heyman Mirkhan from University of Kurdistan, Hawler. I would like to echo what Dr. Joseph said about the Chinese soft power and Dr. Abdullah's and Mrs. Anas about the China's role. I mean, the Chinese are investing very aggressively, for example, here in Iraq. They are already $6 to $7 billion project, and look at the project that they're gonna do. Power station, solar power plants, 1,000 schools, which would lead to their image, the good image that they're going to have here. Why is that happening? Because they're state-owned credit agencies, they are taking more risk. They give the credit, the insurance to their companies to invest with the local companies here. And Mrs. Anas mentioned I think it's next month's, right, conference in Riyadh. So we'll see a lot of financial involvement of China in these countries, which led to the growing popularity of China, which I think they're going to be a very, very important actor in the region in the foreseeable future.
I think you're right about that. Ma'am. Okay. Yeah. Great. Final question, please.
So actually, no one spoke about the U.S. Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. That's a very ambitious plan, $200 billion in the first 2 years and $600 billion in the next 5. So my question is, if I can find it, is this a viable contender against China's Belt and Road Initiative? Because as we see with China, there is no stipulation, and I'm not sure there's actually any stipulations with the U.S. plan. Or is it too late? And any other thoughts you might have on this topic? Thank you.
Well, I think there's a sober recognition, I mean, to try to answer your question, in the United States, that the U.S., even in conjunction with allies, are not going to be able to out-China China in the development of large-scale infrastructure projects for precisely the reason that this gentleman raised. I mean, PRC has the ability to move capital the way one would move water through a bathtub in concentrated ways, in targeting select projects that it wants to do for economic, political, and also strategic reasons. The US, as you're well aware, is just not set up that way to be able to compete with China in large ticket infrastructure projects. What I do believe the US and other like-minded countries could benefit from would be thinking about the higher end telecommunications systems, where it's very important to compete, I think, with the sort of closed architecture telecom systems that are being developed and deployed by China, but also in the important systems to sustain and enrich life, like education and healthcare. I mean, these are real areas where I think US has a natural advantage. And did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think just my understanding too, and again, I'm talking a bit more about the point of view of officials in the region, is that, again, the global plan for infrastructure is a, reaction to the Belt and Road several years later, and it's just perceived as sort of U.S. strategy is solely focused on countering China rather than coming up with kind of their own strategy. Like, is that really a strategy? And obviously, I know that many people think that that is a very crucial strategy, but I mean, from the perspective of, again, leaders in the Middle East, there's this real resistance to the region turning into this sort of theater for the U.S. countering China. And I just think that, or if you look at something like Huawei and IT and AI as well, I think that there's this perception, again, in the Gulf especially, that, I mean, Huawei has been a major player there for years, and that's not going to change. And I feel like the U.S. is sort of very slowly waking up to that. And is it too late? It could be, yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
Abdullah, the final words, sir.
May I just wanted to say that I gave an example of a small country. I wrote it down. I forgot to mention it earlier. It's just Singapore, a country that lives in almost, there is no country, is no exact condition, but it lives in a situation like that. And look at how it's actually not only survived, but prospered as well. So that's one lesson we could learn. I think as far as, there was something else from the gentleman over there who's talked about, we haven't seen a new world order. I agree. The world order doesn't necessarily happen overnight. It takes time. And we are going through kind of a gestation time. And it's a labor that we have to go through. And until the new world order is born, it could be very dangerous. We don't know what's going to happen in between. But I think when the new world order happens, it's going to be multipolar. And I think we're going to see not necessarily all countries are going to be, all the powers are going to be equal, but there will be other powers that are going to be sharing some of the global responsibility and global power, as it were. But just to answer your question, I think it will be wrong for the United States to just start to think about competing with China, as my colleagues have mentioned. But there are other ways of doing it, and that is to cooperate and compete. You can cooperate in certain areas. Why not use the Chinese investments and the Chinese trade, etc., to also benefit? It benefits the region because the region wants it, so you cannot stop it. But and you can try and guide that in a way that it can be helpful to you, and compete in certain respects where you think it's, the American national interest is at stake. And there isn't anything that stops that, and which is normal. It happens everywhere. All countries in the world, they actually do cooperate and compete. And, the United States has got to learn how to do this. But just to try and imitate China the way that it does, it's a different mindset, a different way of doing things. It's not going to work. So I think cooperation is very important, and maybe competition.
And maybe competition. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for this very useful and helpful discussion. And thank you especially to all of the people here at AU Kurdistan for all of the work they've done to make this first day a success. And we look forward, of course, to doing this again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I would like you to stay seated for a couple of minutes, even the panel members. As the day is coming to an end, we have witnessed wonderful sessions and discussions. I would like to call for the closing remarks on Dr. Hunar Isa, the Secretary of the Board of Trustees of the American University of Kurdistan. Thank you very much. Welcome.
I know it's been a very long day, and the last thing that you want to hear is my speech. But I'll make sure I make it short. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, I'm delighted that we have completed Day 2 of MEPS Forum on a high note. We were very privileged to host 3 parallel workshops yesterday and address some of the most pressing challenges to regional and international security. Our workshops constitute one of the central pillars of MEPS Forum and its values. They provide the space for candid discussions, a medium for engaging in intellectually rigorous debates, and an avenue for forging policy recommendations that address a wide range of political, economic, socioeconomic challenges in Iraq and the Middle East at large. Most importantly, such workshops enable exchanges with our talented students and graduates and serve as a bridge between students and scholars in Kurdistan and the wider international community of experts and decision makers. For that, I'm particularly grateful on behalf of the American University of Kurdistan and the American University of Kurdistan Foundation to our workshop partners, the Crisis Response Council, the United States Institute of Peace, Middle East Institute, and Iraq Policy Group. This year's sessions have had and will continue to have a particular focus on climate change and the imperative of forging a holistic approach to the crisis, both at the local and national level and at the regional and international level. This could not be more timely in light of recent challenges to international security, the COP27 summit in Egypt, and the urgent need to address climate-induced challenges in Iraq, which is the world's fifth most vulnerable country to climate change. Tomorrow's sessions will build on the excellence and rigor of past 2 days. We're honored to be hosting the President of Kurdistan, His Excellency Nechirvan Barzani, yet to be confirmed, and the Prime Minister of Kurdistan, His Excellency Masroor Barzani, and we look forward to welcoming Iraq's newly appointed President, His Excellency Abdul Latif Rashid, and Iraq's Speaker of Parliament, His Excellency Mohammad Al-Halbusi, along with a number of other distinguished guests and speakers. I thank all of our speakers and workshop participants who took part in the session and unfold yesterday and today, and look forward to welcoming you all back again tomorrow. I wish you a very good evening, and thank you very much for the insightful panel discussion.